Hey guys. So we're all having a bit of a, hard, weird time right now. It's very strange. uh, Whenever I lose sight of where I'm going, what I'm doing, why I am on the planet, I always come back to Eckhart's teachings. Well, they're my favorite. So I have a new earth here, and it's probably appearing backwards for you. I don't know. But I have decided I would like to read to you the last chapter. It's really nice to be read to sometimes. It's really relaxing and can take you away from whatever you've been worried about. So sit back and enjoy. So let's just skip straight to the back. Chapter 10, A New Earth. Astronomers have discovered evidence to suggest that the universe came into existence 15 billion years ago in a galactic explosion and has been expanding ever since. Not only has it been expanding, but it is also growing in complexity and becoming more and more differentiated. Some scientists also postulate that this movement from unity to multiplicity will eventually become reversed. The universe will then stop expanding and begin to contract again, finally return to the unmanifested, the inconceivable, nothingness out of which it came, and perhaps repeat the cycles of birth, expansion, contraction, and death again and again. For what purpose? Why does the universe go to all the bother of existing? Asked physicist Stephen Hawking, realizing at the time that there was no mathematical model that could ever supply the answer. If you look within rather than only without, however, you discover that you have an inner and an outer purpose. And since you are a microscopic reflection of the macrocosm, it follows that the universe too has an inner and an outer purpose, inseparable from yours. The outer purpose of the universe is to create form and experience the interaction of forms, the play, the dream, the drama, or whatever you choose to call it. Its inner purpose is to awaken to its formless essence. Then comes the reconciliation of outer and inner purpose. To bring that essence, consciousness, into the world of form, and thereby transform the world. The ultimate purpose of that transformation goes far beyond anything the human mind can imagine or comprehend. And yet, on this planet, at this time, that transformation is the task allotted to us. That is the reconciliation of outer and inner purpose, the reconciliation of the world and God. Before we look at the relevance, the expansion, and the contraction of the universe has to your own life, we need to bear in mind here that nothing we say about the nature of the universe should be taken as the absolute truth. Neither concepts nor mathematical formula can explain the infinite. No thought can encapsulate the vastness of the totality. Reality is the unified whole, but thought cuts it up into fragments. This gives rise to fundamental misperceptions. For example, that there are separate things and events, or that this is the cause of that. Every thought implies a perspective, and every perspective, by its very nature, implies limitation, which ultimately means that it is not true, at least not absolutely. Only the whole is true, but the whole cannot be spoken or thought. Seen from beyond the limitations of thinking and therefore incomprehensible to the human mind, everything is happening now. All that ever has been or will be is now, outside of time, which is a mental construct. As an illustration of relative and absolute truth, consider the sunrise and sunset. When we say the sun rises in the morning and sets in the evening, that is true, but only relatively. In absolute terms, it is false. Only from the limited perspective of an observer on or near the planet's surface does the sun rise and set. If you were far out in space, you would see that the sun neither rises nor sets, but that it shines continually. And yet, even after realizing that, we can continue to speak of the sunrise or sunset, still see its beauty, paint it, write poems about it, even though we now know that it is a relative rather than an absolute truth. So let us continue to speak for a moment of another relative truth, the coming into form of the universe and its return to the formless, which implies the limited perspective of time, and see what the relevance this has to your own life. The notion of my own life is, of course, another limited perspective created by thought, another relative truth. There is ultimately no such thing as your life, since you and life are not two, but one. A brief history of your life. The coming into manifestation of the world, as well as its return to the unmanifested, its expansion and contraction, are two universal movements that we could call the outgoing and the return home. Those two movements are reflected throughout the universe in many ways, such as in the incessant expansion and contraction of your heart, as well as the inhalation and exhalation of your breath. They are also reflected in the cycles of sleep and wakefulness. Each night, without knowing it, you return to the unmanifested source of all life when you enter the stage of deep, dreamless sleep, and then re-emerge again in the morning, replenished. These two movements, the outgoing and the return, are also reflected in each person's life cycles. Out of nowhere, so to speak, you suddenly appear in the world. Birth is followed by expansion. There is not only physical growth, but also growth of knowledge, activities, possessions, experiences. Your sphere of influence expands and life becomes increasingly complex. This is a time when you are mainly concerned with finding or pursuing your outer purpose. Usually, there is also a corresponding growth of the ego, which is identification with all the above things. And so your form identity becomes more and more defined. This is also the time when outer purpose, growth, tends to become usurped by the ego, which, unlike nature, does not know when to stop in its pursuits for expansion and has a voracious appetite for more. And then, when you thought you'd made it or that you belong here, the return movement begins. Perhaps people close to you begin to die, people who were part of your world. Then your physical form weakens, your sphere of influence shrinks. Instead of becoming more, you now become less, and the ego reacts to this with increasing anxiety or depression. your world is beginning to contract, and you may find you are not in control anymore. Instead of acting upon life, life now acts upon you by slowly reducing your world. The consciousness that identified with form is now experiencing the sunset, the dissolution of form, and then one day you too disappear. Your armchair is still there, but instead of you sitting in it, there is just an empty space. You went back to where you came from just a few years ago. Each person's life, each life form, in fact, represents a world, a unique way in which the universe experiences itself. And when your form dissolves, a world comes to an end, one of countless worlds. Awakening and the return movement. The return movement in a person's life, the weakening or dissolution of form, whether through old age, illness, disability, loss, or some kind of personal tragedy, carries great potential for spiritual awakening. The disidentification of consciousness from form. Since there is very little spiritual truth in our contemporary culture, not many people recognize this is an opportunity, and so when it happens to them or to someone close to them, they think there is something dreadfully wrong, something that should not be happening. There is in our civilization a great deal of ignorance about the human condition, and the more spiritually ignorant you are, the more you suffer. For many people, particularly in the West, death is no more than an abstract concept, and so they have no idea what happens to the human form when it approaches dissolution. Most decrepit and old people are shut away in nursing homes. Dead bodies, which in some older cultures are on open display for all to see, are hidden away. Try to see a dead body and you will find that it is virtually illegal, except if the deceased is a close family member. In funeral homes, they even apply makeup to the face. You are only allowed to see a sanitized version of death. Since death is only an abstract concept to them, most people are totally unprepared for the dissolution of form that awaits them. When it approaches, there is shock, incomprehension, despair, and great fear. Nothing makes sense anymore, because all meaning and purpose that life had for them was associated with accumulating, succeeding, building, protecting, and sense gratification. It was associated with the outward movement and identification with form. This is to say, ego. Most people cannot conceive of any meaning when their life, their world, is being demolished, and yet potentially there is even deeper meaning here than in the outward movement. This is precisely through the onset of old age, through loss or personal tragedy, that the spiritual dimension would traditionally come into people's lives. This is to say, their inner purpose would emerge only as their outer purpose collapsed, and the shell of ego would begin to crack open. Such events represent the beginning of the return movement towards the dissolution from form. In most ancient cultures, there must have been an intuitive understanding of this process, which is why old people were respected and revered. They were the repositories of wisdom and provided the dimension of depth, without which no civilization can survive for long. In our civilization, which is totally identified with the outer and ignorant of the inner dimension of spirit, the word old has a mainly negative connotations. It equals useless, and so we regard it as almost an insult to refer to someone as old. To avoid the word, we use euphemisms such as elderly and senior. The First Nations grandmother is a figure of great dignity. Today's granny is at best cute. Why is old considered useless? Because in old age, the emphasis shifts from doing to being, and our civilization, which is lost in doing, knows nothing of being. It asks being, what do you do with it? In some people, the outward movement of growth and expansion gets severely disrupted by a seemingly premature onset of the return movement, the dissolving of form. In some cases, it is a temporary disruption. In others, a permanent one. We believe that a young child should not have to face death. But the fact is, some children do have to face death. Of one or both parents through illness, accident, or even possibly their own death. Some children are born with disabilities that severely restrict the natural expansion of their lives, or some severe limitation comes into a person's life at a relatively young age. This disruption of the outward movement at a time when it is not meant to be happening can also potentially bring forth an early spiritual awakening in a person. Ultimately, nothing happens that is not meant to happen, which is to say, nothing happens that is not part of the greater whole and its purpose. Thus, destruction or disruption of outer purpose can lead to finding your inner purpose, and subsequently, the arising of a deeper outer purpose that is aligned with the inner. Children who have suffered greatly often grow into young adults who are mature beyond their years. What is lost on the level of form is gained on the level of essence. In the traditional figure of the blind seer or the wounded healer of ancient cultures and legend, some great loss or disability on the level of form has become an opening to spirit. When you have had a direct experience of the unstable nature of all forms, you will likely never overvalue form again, and thus lose yourself by blindly pursuing it or attaching yourself to it. The opportunity that the dissolution of form, and in particular old age, represents is only just beginning to be recognized in our contemporary culture. In the majority of people, that opportunity is still tragically missed because the ego identifies with the return movement just as it identified with the outward movement. This results in the hardening of the egoic shell, a contraction rather than an opening. The diminished ego then spends the rest of its days whining or complaining, trapped in fear or anger, self-pity, guilt, blame, or other negative emotional states, or avoidance strategies, such as attachment to memories and thinking about the past. When the ego is no longer identified with the return movement in a person's life, old age or approaching death becomes what it is meant to be, an opening into the realm of spirit. I have met old people who were living embodiments of this process. They had become radiant. Their weakening forms had become transparent to the light of consciousness. On the new earth, old age will be universally recognized and highly valued as a time for the flowering of consciousness. For those who are still lost in the outer circumstances of their lives, it will be a time of late homecoming, when they awaken to their inner purpose. For many others, it will represent an intensification and accumulation of the awakening process. awakening, and the outgoing movement. The natural expansion of one's life that comes from the outward movement has traditionally been usurped by the ego and used for its own expansion. Look at what I can do. I bet you can't do that, says a small child to another as he discovers the increasing strength and abilities of his body. That is one of the ego's first attempts to enhance itself through identification with the outward movement and the concept of more than you, and to strengthen itself by diminishing others. It is, of course, only the beginning of the ego's many misperceptions. However, as your awareness increases and the ego is no longer running your life, you don't have to wait for your world to shrink or collapse through old age or personal tragedy in order for you to awaken to your inner purpose. As the new consciousness is beginning to emerge on the planet, an increasing number of people no longer need to be shaken to have an awakening. They embrace the awakening process voluntarily, even while still engaged in the outward cycle of growth and expansion. When that cycle is no longer usurped by the ego, the spiritual dimension will come into this world through the outward movement, thought, speech, action, creation, as powerfully as through the return movement, stillness, being, the dissolution of form. Until now, human intelligence, which is no more than a minute aspect of universal intelligence, has been distorted and misused by the ego. I call that intelligence in the service of madness. Splitting the atom requires great intelligence. Using that intelligence for building and stockpiling atom bombs is insane, or at best, extremely unintelligent. Stupidity is relatively harmless, but intelligent stupidity is highly dangerous. This intelligent stupidity, for which one could find countless obvious examples, is threatening the survival of our species. Without the impairment of egoic dysfunction, our intelligence comes into full alignment with the outgoing cycle of universal intelligence and its impulse to create. We become conscious participants in the creation of form. It is not we who create, but universal intelligence that creates through us. We don't identify with what we create, and so we don't lose ourselves in what we do. We are learning that the act of creation may involve energy of the highest intensity, but that is not hard work or stressful. We need to understand the difference between stress and intensity, as we shall see. Struggle or stress is a sign that the ego has returned as are negative reactions when we encounter obstacles. The force behind the ego's wanting creates enemies, that is to say, reaction in the form of opposing force and equal in intensity. The stronger the ego, the stronger the sense of separateness between people. The only actions that do not cause opposing reactions are those that are aimed at the good of all. They are inclusive, not exclusive. They join, they don't separate. They are not for my country, but for all of humanity. Not for my religion, but for the emergence of consciousness in all human beings. Not for my species, but for all sentient beings and all of nature. We are also learning that action, although necessary, is only a secondary factor in manifesting our external reality. The primary factor in creation is consciousness. No matter how active we are, how much effort we make, our state of consciousness creates our world. And if there is no change on that inner level, no amount of action will make any difference. We would only recreate modified versions of the same world again and again, a world that is an external reflection of the ego. Consciousness. Consciousness is already conscious. It is the unmanifested, the eternal. The universe, however, is only gradually becoming conscious. Consciousness itself is timeless and therefore does not evolve. It was never born and does not die. When consciousness becomes the manifested universe, it appears to be the subject to time and to undergo an evolutionary process. No human mind is capable of comprehending fully the reason for this process, but we can glimpse it within ourselves and become a conscious participant in it. Consciousness is the intelligence, the organizing principle behind the arising of form. Consciousness has been preparing forms for millions of years so that it can express itself through them in the manifested. Although the unmanifested realm of pure consciousness could be considered another dimension, it is not separate from this dimension of form. Form and formlessness interpenetrate. The unmanifested flows into this dimension as awareness, inner space, presence. How does it do that? Through the human form that becomes conscious and thus fulfills its destiny. The human form was created for this higher purpose, and millions of other forms prepared the ground for it. Consciousness incarnates into the manifested dimension, that is to say, it becomes form. When it does so, it enters a dreamlike state. Intelligence remains, but consciousness becomes unconscious of itself. It loses itself in form, becomes identified with forms. This could be described as the descent of the divine into matter. At that stage in the evolution of the universe, the entire outgoing movement takes place in that dreamlike state. Glimpses of awakening come only at the moment of the dissolution of an individual form, that is to say, death. And then begins the next incarnation with form, the next individual dream that is part of the collective dream. When the lion tears apart the body of the zebra, the consciousness that incarnated into the zebra form detaches itself from the dissolving form and for a brief moment awakens to its essential immortal nature as consciousness, and then immediately falls back into sleep and reincarnates into another form. When the lion becomes old and cannot hunt anymore, as it draws its last breath, there is again the briefest of glimpses of an awakening, followed by another dream of form. On our planet, the human ego represents the final stage of universal sleep, the identification of consciousness with form. It was a necessary stage in the evolution of consciousness. The human brain is a highly differentiated form through which consciousness enters this dimension. It contains approximately 100 billion nerve cells, called neurons, about the same number as there are stars in our galaxy, which could be seen as a macrocosmic brain. The brain does not create consciousness, but consciousness created the brain, the most complex physical form on earth for its expression. When the brain gets damaged, it does not mean you lose consciousness. It means consciousness can no longer use that form to enter this dimension. You cannot lose consciousness because it is, in essence, who you are. You can only lose something that you have, but you cannot lose something that you are. Awakened doing. Awakened doing is the outer aspect of the new stage in the evolution of consciousness on our planet. The closer we get to the end of our present evolutionary stage, the more dysfunctional the ego becomes, in the same way that a caterpillar becomes dysfunctional just before it transforms into a butterfly. But the new consciousness is arising, even as the old dissolves. We are in the midst of a momentous event in the evolution of human consciousness. But they won't be talking about it on the news tonight. On our planet, and perhaps simultaneously in many parts of our galaxy and beyond, consciousness is awakening from the dream of form. This does not mean all forms, the world, are going to dissolve, although quite a few most certainly will. It means consciousness can now begin to create form without losing itself in it. It can remain conscious of itself, even while it creates and experiences form. Why should it continue to create and experience form? For the enjoyment of it. How does consciousness do that? Through awakened humans who have learned the meaning of awakened doing. Awakened doing is the alignment of your outer purpose, what you do, with your inner purpose, awakening and staying awake. Through awakened doing, you become one with the outgoing purpose of the universe. Consciousness flows through you into this world. It flows into your thoughts and inspires them. It flows into what you do, guides and empowers it. Now what you do, not what you do, but how you do what you do, determines whether you are fulfilling your destiny. And how you want, so many funny words here, sorry. And how you do what you do is determined by your state of consciousness. A reversal of your priorities comes about when the main purpose for doing what you do becomes the doing itself, or rather, the current of consciousness that flows into what you do. That current of consciousness is what determines quality. Another way of putting it, in any situation, in whatever you do, your state of consciousness is the primary factor. The situation and what you do is secondary. Future success is dependent upon and inseparable from the consciousness out of which the actions emanate. That can be either the reactive force of the ego or the alert attention of awakened consciousness. All truly successful action comes out of that field of alert attention rather than form ego and conditioned unconscious thinking. The three modalities of awakened doing. There are three ways in which consciousness can flow into what you do, and thus through you into this world. 3 modalities in which you can align your life with the creative power of the universe. Modality means the underlying energy frequency that flows into what you do and connects your actions with the awakened consciousness that is emerging into this world. What you do will be dysfunctional and of the ego unless it arises out of one of these 3 modalities. They may change during the course of a day, although one of them may be dominant during a certain stage in your life. Each modality is appropriate to certain situations. The modalities of awakened doing are acceptance, enjoyment, and enthusiasm. Each one represents a certain vibrational frequency of consciousness. You need to be vigilant to make sure that one of them operates whenever you are engaged in doing anything at all, from the most simple task to the most complex. If you are not in the state of either acceptance, enjoyment, or enthusiasm, look closely and you will find that you are creating suffering for yourself and others. Acceptance. Whatever you cannot enjoy doing, you can at least accept that this is what you have to do. Acceptance means, for now, this is what this situation, this moment requires me to do, and so I do it willingly. We already spoke at length about the importance of inner acceptance of what happens and acceptance of what, We already spoke at length about the importance of inner acceptance of what happens, and acceptance of what you have to do is just another aspect of it. For example, you probably won't be able to enjoy changing the flat tire on your car at night in the middle of nowhere in the pouring rain, let alone be enthusiastic about it. But you can bring acceptance to it. Performing an action in the state of acceptance means you are at peace while you do it. That peace is a subtle energy vibration, which then flows into what you do. On the surface, acceptance looks like a passive state, but in reality, it is active and creative because it brings something entirely new into this world. That peace, that subtle energy vibration, is consciousness. And one of the ways in which it enters this world is through surrendered action, one aspect of which is acceptance. If you can neither enjoy nor bring acceptance to what you do, stop. Otherwise, you are not taking responsibility for the only thing that you can really take responsibility for, which also happens to be one thing that really matters, your state of consciousness. And if you are not taking responsibility for your state of consciousness, you are not taking responsibility for your life. Enjoyment. The peace that comes with surrendered action turns to a sense of aliveness when you actually enjoy what you are doing. Enjoyment is the second modality of awakened doing on the new earth. Enjoyment will replace wanting as the motivating power behind people's actions. Wanting arises from the ego's delusion that you are a separate fragment that is disconnected from the power that lies behind all creation. Through enjoyment, you link into that universal creative power itself. When you make the present moment instead of the past and future the focal point of your life, your ability to enjoy what you do, and with it the quality of your life, increases dramatically. Joy is the dynamic aspect of being. When the creative power of the universe becomes conscious of itself, it manifests as joy. You don't have to wait for something meaningful to come into your life so that you can finally enjoy what you do. There is more meaning in joy than you will ever need. The waiting to start living syndrome is one of the most common delusions of the unconscious state. Expansion and positive change on the outer level is much more likely to come into your life if you can enjoy what you are doing already, instead of waiting for some change so that you can start enjoying what you do. Don't ask your mind for permission to enjoy what you do. All you will get is plenty of reasons why you can't enjoy it. Not now, the mind will say. Can't you see I'm busy? There's no time. Maybe tomorrow you can start enjoying. That tomorrow will never come unless you begin enjoying what you are doing now. When you say, I enjoy doing this or that, it is really a misperception. It makes it appear that the joy comes from what you do. But that is not the case. Joy does not come from what you do. It flows into what you do and thus into the world from deep within you. This misperception that joy comes from what you do is normal, and it is also dangerous because it creates the belief that joy is something that can be derived from something else, such as an activity or thing. You then look to the world to bring you joy, happiness, but it cannot do that. This is why many people live in constant frustration. The world is not giving them what they think they need. Then what is the relationship between something that you do and the state of joy? You will enjoy any activity in which you are fully present, any activity that is not just a means to an end. It isn't the action you perform that you really enjoy, but the deep sense of aliveness that flows into it. That aliveness is one with who you are. This means that when you enjoy doing something, you are really experiencing the joy of being in its dynamic aspect. That's why anything you enjoy doing connects you with the power behind all creation. Here is a spiritual practice that will bring empowerment and creative expansion into your life. Make a list of the number of everyday routine activities that you perform frequently. Include activities that you may consider uninteresting, boring, tedious, irritating, or stressful. But don't include anything that you hate or detest doing. That's a case for either acceptance or for stopping what you are doing. The list may include traveling to and from work, buying groceries, doing your laundry, or anything that you find tedious or stressful in your daily work. Then, whenever you are engaged in those activities, let them be a vehicle for alertness. Be absolutely present in what you do and sense the alert, alive subtleness within you in the background of the activity. You will soon find that what you do in such a state of heightened awareness, instead of being stressful, tedious, or irritating, is actually becoming enjoyable. To be more precise, what you are enjoying is not really the outward action, but the inner dimension of consciousness that flows into the action. This is finding the joy of being in what you are doing. If you feel your life lacks significance or is too stressful or tedious, it is because you haven't brought that dimension into your life yet. Being conscious in what you do has not yet become your main aim. The new earth arises as more and more people discover that their main purpose in life is to bring the light of consciousness into this world, and so use whatever they do as a vehicle for consciousness. The joy of being is the joy of being conscious. Awakened consciousness then takes over from the ego and begins to run your life. You may then find that an activity that you have been engaged in for a long time naturally begins to expand into something much bigger when it becomes empowered by consciousness. Some of those people who, through creative action, enrich the lives of many others, simply do what they enjoy doing most without wanting to achieve or become anything through that activity. They may be musicians, artists, writers, scientists, teachers, or builders. They may bring into manifestation new social or business structures, enlightened businesses. Sometimes, for a few years, their sphere of influence remains small, and then it can happen that suddenly or gradually a wave of creative empowerment flows into what they do, and their activity expands beyond anything they could have imagined and touches countless others. In addition to enjoyment, an intensity is now added to what they do, and with it comes a creativity that goes beyond anything the ordinary human could accomplish. But don't let it go to your head, because up there is where the remnant of ego may be hiding. You are still an ordinary human. What is extraordinary is what comes through you into this world. But that essence you share with all beings. The 14th century Persian poet and Sufi master Hafiz expressed this truth beautifully. I am a hole in the flute that the Christ's breath moves through. Listen to the music. Enthusiasm. Then there is another way of creative manifestation that may come to those who remain true to their inner purpose of awakening. Suddenly, one day, they know what their outer purpose is. They have a great vision, a goal, and from then on they work towards implementing that goal. Their goal or vision is usually connected in some way to something that on a smaller scale they are doing and enjoying doing already. This is where the third modality of awakened doing arises: enthusiasm. Enthusiasm means there is deep enjoyment in what you do, plus the added element of a goal or a vision that you work towards. When you add a goal to the enjoyment of what you do, the energy field or vibrational frequency changes. A certain degree of what we might call structural tension is now added to enjoyment, and so it turns into enthusiasm. At this height of creative activity, fueled by enthusiasm, there will be enormous intensity and energy behind what you do. You will feel like an arrow that is moving towards the target and enjoying the journey. To an onlooker, it may appear that you are under stress, but the intensity of enthusiasm has nothing to do with stress. When you want to arrive at your goal more than you want to be doing what you are doing, you become stressed. The balance between enjoyment and structural tension is lost, and the latter has won. When there is stress, it is usually a sign that the ego has returned, and you are cutting yourself off from the creative power of the universe. Instead, there is only the force and strain of egoic wanting. And so you have to struggle and work hard to make it. Stress always diminishes both the quality and effectiveness of what you do under its influence. There is also a strong link between stress and negative emotions, such as anxiety and anger. It is toxic to the body and is now becoming recognized as one of the main causes of the so-called degenerative diseases such as cancer and heart disease. Unlike stress, enthusiasm has a high energy frequency and so resonates with the creative power of the universe. This is why Ralph Waldo Emerson said that nothing great has ever been achieved without enthusiasm. The word enthusiasm comes from ancient Greek, en and theos, meaning God, and the related word enthusiasm, which means to be possessed by a god. With enthusiasm, you will find that you don't have to do it all by yourself. In fact, there is nothing of significance that you can do by yourself. Sustained enthusiasm brings into existence a wave of creative energy, and all you have to do then is ride the wave. Enthusiasm brings an enormous empowerment into what you do, so that all those who have not accessed that power would look upon your achievements in awe and may equate them with who you are. You, however, know that the truth that Jesus pointed to when he said, "I can of my own self do nothing." Unlike egoic wanting, which creates opposition in direct proportion to the intensity of its wanting, enthusiasm never opposes. It is non-confrontational. Its activity does not create winners or losers. It is based on inclusion, not exclusion of others. It does not need to use and manipulate people because it is the power of creation itself, and so does not need to take energy from some secondary source. The ego's wanting always tries to take from something or someone. Enthusiasm gives out of its own abundance. When enthusiasm encounters obstacles in the form of adverse situations or uncooperative people, it never attacks, but walks around them, or by yielding or embracing, turns the opposing energy into a helpful one, the foe into a friend. Enthusiasm and the ego cannot coexist. One implies the absence of the other. Enthusiasm knows where it is going, but at the same time, it is deeply at one with the present moment, the source of its aliveness, its joy and its power. Enthusiasm wants nothing because it lacks nothing. It is at one with life, and no matter how dynamic the enthusiasm-inspired activities are, you don't lose yourself in them. And there remains always a still but intensely alive space at the center of the wheel, a core of peace in the midst of activity that is both the source of all and untouched by it all. Through enthusiasm, you enter into full alignment with the outgoing creative principle of the universe, but without identifying with its creations, that is to say, without ego. Where there is no identification, there is no attachment. One of the great sources of suffering. Once a wave of creative energy has passed, structural tension diminishes again, and joy in what you are doing remains. Nobody can live in enthusiasm all the time. A new wave of creative energy may come later and lead to a renewed enthusiasm. When the return movement towards the dissolution of form sets in, enthusiasm no longer serves you. Enthusiasm belongs to the outgoing cycle of life. It is only through surrender that you can align yourself with the return movement, the journey home. To sum up, enjoyment of what you are doing, combined with the goal or a vision that you work towards, becomes enthusiasm. Even though you have a goal, what you are doing in the present moment needs to remain the focal point of your attention. Otherwise, you will fall out of alignment with the universal purpose. Make sure your vision or goal is not an inflated image of yourself and therefore a concealed form of ego, such as wanting to become a movie star, a famous writer, or a wealthy entrepreneur. Also, make sure your goal is not focused on having this or that, such as a mansion by the sea, your own company, or $10 million in the bank. An enlarged image of yourself or a vision of yourself having this or that are all static goals and therefore don't empower you. Instead, make sure your goals are dynamic, that is to say, point towards an activity that you are engaged in and through which you are connected to other human beings as well as to the whole. Instead of seeing yourself as a famous actor and writer and so on, see yourself inspiring countless people with your work and enriching their lives. Feel how that activity enriches or deepens not only your own life, but that of countless others. Feel yourself being opened through being an opening through which energy flows from the unmanifested source of all life through you for the benefit of all. All this implies that your goal or vision is then already a reality within you. On the level of mind and of feeling, enthusiasm is the power that transfers the mental blueprint into the physical dimension. That is the creative use of the mind, and that is why there is no wanting involved. You cannot manifest what you want. You can only manifest what you already have. You may get what you want through hard work and stress, but that is not the way of the new earth. Jesus gave the key to the creative use of the mind and to the conscious manifestation of form when he said, "Whatever you ask in prayer, believe that you have received it, and it will be yours." The frequency holders. The outward movement into form does not express itself with equal intensity in all people. Some feel a strong urge to build, create, become involved, achieve, make an impact upon the world. If they are unconscious, their ego will, of course, take over and use the energy of the outgoing cycle for its own purposes. This, however, also greatly reduces the flow of creative energy available to them, and increasingly they need to rely on efforting to get what they want. If they are conscious, those people in whom the outward movement is strong will be highly creative. Others, after the natural expansion that comes with growing up has run its course, lead an outwardly unremarkable, seemingly more passive and relatively uneventful existence. They are more inward looking by nature, and for them the outward movement into form is minimal. They would rather return home than go out. They have no desire to get strongly involved in or change the world. If they have any ambitions, they usually don't go beyond finding something to do that gives them a degree of independence. Some of them find it hard to fit into this world. Some are lucky enough to find a protective niche where they can lead a relatively sheltered life, a job that provides them with a regular income or a small business of their own. Some may feel drawn toward living in a spiritual community or a monastery. Others may become dropouts and live on the margins of society, on the margins of a society they feel they have little in common with. Some turn to drugs because they find living in this world too painful. Others eventually become healers or spiritual teachers, that is to say, teachers of being. In past ages, they probably would have been called contemplatives. There is no place for them, it seems, in our contemporary civilization. On the arising new earth, however, their role is just as vital as that of the creators, the doers, the reformers. Their function is to anchor the frequency of the new consciousness on this planet. I call them the frequency holders. They are here to generate consciousness through the activities of daily life, through their interactions with others, as well as through just being. In this way, they endow the seemingly insignificant with profound meaning. Their task is to bring spacious stillness into this world by being absolutely present in whatever they do. There is consciousness and therefore quality in what they do, even the simplest task. Their purpose is to do everything in a sacred manner. Each human being is an integral part of the collective human consciousness. They affect the world much more deeply than is visible on the surface of their lives. The new earth is no utopia. Is the notion of a new earth not just another utopian vision? Not at all. All utopian visions have this in common: the mental projection of a future time when all will be well, we will be saved, there will be peace and harmony, and the end of our problems. There have been many such utopian visions. Some ended in disappointment, others in disaster. At the core of all utopian visions lies one of the main structural dysfunctions of the old consciousness: looking to the future for salvation. The only existence the future actually has is as a thought form in your mind. So when you look to the future for salvation, you are unconsciously looking into your own mind for salvation. You are trapped in form, and that is ego. And I saw a new heaven and a new earth, writes the biblical prophet. The foundation of a new earth is a new heaven, the awakened consciousness, the earth. The external reality is only its outer reflection. The arising of a new heaven, and by implication a new earth, are not future events that are going to make us free. Nothing is going to make us free, because only the present moment can make us free. That realization is the awakening. Awakening as a future event has no meaning because awakening is the realization of presence. So, the new heaven, the awakened consciousness, is not a future state to be achieved. Excuse me. A new heaven and a new earth are arising within you at this moment. And if they are not arising within you at this moment, they are no more than a thought in your head, and therefore not arising at all. What did Jesus tell his disciples? Heaven is right here in the midst of you. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus makes a prediction that to this day few people have understood. He says, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." In the modern versions of the Bible, meek is translated as humble. Who are the meek or the humble? What does it mean that they shall inherit the earth? The meek are the egoless. They are those who have awakened to their essential true nature as consciousness and recognize that essence in all others, all life forms. They live in a surrendered state and so feel their oneness with the whole and the source. They embody the awakened consciousness that is challenging all aspects of life on our planet, including nature, because life on earth is inseparable from the human consciousness that perceives and interacts with it. That is the sense in which the meek will inherit the earth. A new species is arising on the planet. It is arising now, and you are it. If you managed to watch this all the way through, thank you. It's given me great joy to share this chapter of Eckhart's work with you. If you would like to purchase this book, I will put the link to Booktopia below. I struggle to remain awake, and I'm not alone. I'm not alone in that. It is always good to come back to the original teaching and remind myself why I'm here. I just feel really good after reading that. I hope you do too. Okay. Well, actually, I will tell you this. I recently created a method to encapsulate some of Eckhart's awakened doings. So I was trying to cultivate more joy in my life at the same time as reminding myself to be present within my body. And I came up with this method, which I have named the Holy Shit Method, because holy shit, we are alive and it is incredible to be here. There are so many wonderful, bizarre, incredibly surprising things you can find in your everyday life about being alive. We just got so conditioned out of that. And I've worked really hard to bring that joy of being back into my life, and this method that I came up with was definitely the deal breaker for me. It changed everything after I started practicing this. I really got into a rhythm of being able to embody presence and joy so much easier. So that's the holy shit method, and you get that when you subscribe to my blog. So I will, you can go to my website, emmakoto.com, and subscribe there, or I will try to figure out how to link it below as well. Okay, so I love you all very, very much, and I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I really hope you enjoyed that little reading by Eckhart, and that it helps you in some way. Okay, bye.